The idea is coming together, and you have a team of skilled and knowledgeable people ready to tackle this thing. Now it's time to analyze the situation, set goals, and get ready to open the floodgates. We're getting ducks in a row this week. This is Knuckles on Doors, and I'm Ben Marcus. Number 3. I'm really happy with how this whole podcast is shaping up and just got my first interview on the books, which I'll share in this next week. Keep sending in suggestions for guests. I'm looking for folks who have successfully organized around an important issue in the area, electoral politics or general advocacy. I want to talk to all of them. Let's share ideas. I know last time I said we're talking about running meetings this week, but as I was writing this out, it became apparent I needed to spend a little more time on planning and making sure you're ready to have your initial meeting. So this is officially my first readjustment. Doesn't mean much in the grand scheme of things, but the more I get into putting this together, the more I want to say. Isn't that always how it works, though? Anyways, keep liking, rating, and sharing. Find me on Facebook and Twitter. I think all the links can be found at knucklesondoors.com, but I should be the first result if you search for Knuckles on Doors as well. Unique name is unique, as they say. I seem to be posting a template of some sort with each episode, so check out the resources section for stuff that's already up there. There's templates for your who, what, where, when, why, and how, and to help identify people who should be on your team, and more stuff is going up all the time. Also, if you have something you'd like to share, please send it along. I'll check it out and share it if it's appropriate. Last week, we talked about how to identify the essential supporters of your idea or campaign in order for it to be successful at the end of the day. Specifically, it's important to keep the goals at the center of the strategy, be it a referendum passed, person elected, or otherwise. That means if it's a rule change by a board members need to be on top of that list. Legislation introduced? You need folks voting on it to actually vote yes. Running for office or putting a referendum on the ballot? You'll need a majority of voters who turn out. So where can you start to look for groups of yes votes? Who are recognized leaders in the communities you're trying to help, and do they agree? Do you know people who have been involved in efforts in the past? What's the history of the issue? Before launching the whole thing, it's more than important to have an idea of the lay of the land. Just like anything else, which way is forward isn't clear if you don't know where you came from. We talked about the basics of asset-based community development, specifically the 4 H's: hands, head, heart, and human. Just to recap, hands is anything you're skilled at. Building a house, playing music, painting, planting a garden. Head is what your brain does well. So a little crossover with hands when it comes to stuff like writing and art. But more so, it's about your ability to express yourself and inspire, and strategic skill sets, being able to look at a situation and see the holes. Heart is passion, what you believe in, what's the fire. And human are your networks of friends, co-workers, acquaintances, neighbors, etc., etc. The people in organizations who you know, and vice versa. There's a pretty self-explanatory diagram up in the resources section of knucklesondoors.com, and I'm going to try to add some interesting surveys you can give to your members to assess skill sets as well. We also talked about what it takes to be a great organizer, constantly on the lookout for people with stories that need to be heard, constantly bouncing ideas off of as many people as possible, constantly pushing folks to the front instead of being the face of the campaign. Obviously, if you're running for office, you need to talk, but we'll get to that soon. And above all else, ensuring you are designing and running plays which are number one, appropriate for the goals and targets in mind, and number two, are focused on building people up, not tearing people down. There's nothing like light to get rid of the dark, as they say. The single most important question to be continually asking yourself is, what am I employing this tactic to do, and will it bring me closer to my goal? If the answer to the latter question, in particular, is I don't know or no, change tactics. Which brings me to the events of this past week or so. Before I get into it, let me just say ahead of time that I am a big proponent of the First Amendment and absolutely believe protest can be effective. I've been arrested a few times for it, particularly in my late teens and early 20s, but if it's applied incorrectly or in a haphazard way, not only will it be ineffective in moving the ball forward on your goal, it can in fact be a net negative tactic in your overall strategy. Unfortunately, I learned that by experience. Let's think through when protest is an appropriate, effective tactic. A quick and substantial mobilization in response to an immediate and tangible situation, especially when made up from high and there's a confusion on the ground. The airport protests after Trump's executive order banning anyone from 7 specific countries is a great example of this. The massive crowds shut down a number of large airports, with officials on the ground not even sure if the order was legal. Once lawyers started showing up, some officials started releasing people. When the initial court order followed, most airports complied immediately. Only a few held out, and even then, not in the way Trump was hoping for. If no one had showed up to the protest, except for a few lawyers, the issue could have been ignored by local officials. But since it basically brought the whole thing to a halt, it had to be addressed. Let's look at labor strikes. Labor strikes can be effective, but only when a critical mass of people are willing to participate. Additionally, general strikes are simply just not effective unless you're able to mobilize significant portions of your target population. Nationwide, we're talking about 25 million people bare minimum. That's about 10% of the adult population. And even then, that's probably not even enough. It's just 10%. Locally, 10% might come off a little better because it's a smaller community. But again, even then, it's just 10%. Is that really impressive enough to demand concessions? Temporary conditions are temporary. Good politicians know that. The two parties certainly can attest to it. Boycotts can also be effective, but only with large enough numbers, again. I personally boycott a number of companies I don't agree with, but in no way do I believe I'm hurting them. Now, don't get me wrong. Sometimes a business does something egregious, and attempting to destroy their business model is just what needs to happen. Just be aware and thoughtful of how to develop a large enough group of willing people to participate to actually have the achieved outcome. It's most likely not going to be a short fight. Large-scale protests can be fantastic PR and recruitment tools in really good unity-building events, truly. But again, that's where that tactic stops. Your goals are almost always going to be at the ballot box or in some sort of decision-making board. At a certain point, it has to be about those goals, about getting those votes, about convincing people to vote your way. A lot of people like to point to the civil rights movement and say it was protest that won the fight, and I'd have to disagree. Those protests we've all seen grainy footage of were rallying points for people who were deeply engaged in the work on local levels. The civil disobedience was targeted and designed to serve specific goals. It wasn't protest for protest's sake, and it certainly wasn't spontaneous or outside of a larger strategy to pass legislation, register people to vote, and threaten people with the loss of their positions if they didn't stand for the right side of history. The goal was more equitable laws to help black and impoverished communities get their full equity as citizens of the United States. It's clearly still an issue we're very much struggling with, to say the absolute least. Now let's look at how it's been applied in the past month. I see a lot of similarities between the Bush-era anti-war protests and what's been going down. The target is amalgamous or simply not affected by the tactic. While it can bring attention to the issue, it permeates an air of subordination as opposed to the dominance they're trying to demonstrate. And above all else, it puts people into strategies which, at the end of the day, won't do a whole lot to convert voters. Sure, leaders can find themselves and grow via movement. Sure, people can be turned on to politics for the first time or in a renewed spirit. But you don't need a protest for that. The same skill sets can be uncovered and built up via local action focused on specific, achievable goals. I get pushback about my views on large-scale protest, and that's perfectly fine. Again, I've participated and organized them, particularly when I was younger, and have been arrested a few times for doing so. It was a lot of fun, and I met a lot of people, and I was super active. Did it accomplish any of the goals we had? Nope. Was the needle moved on changing the policies we were fighting against? Nope. Why? Because our tactics did not fit the strategy, which did not fit the goals. Just think of it like this. Let's say you're playing tug of war with a big group of people, where your side has the edge, but your team just keeps losing. And in response, the call goes out for everyone on your side to just pull as hard as possible and for as long as possible, with no particular ordering of people or any set intervals or anything else. Now, you may be successful. The other team might be tired or caught off guard. Maybe they rearranged people to be less than optimal. Maybe the team captain had to go home and a few people are fighting over who should be in charge. But most likely, if the teams are pretty close in size, the less organized one is going to lose. And if you yell at the other side, it just makes them dig in their heels more, right? The goal is to win. On the flip side, what if your team thought about it for just a second? Ordered people on size and ability, putting your biggest, strongest person in the back as the anchor, identified a leader who called out when it was time to pull and for how long, maybe some direct appeals to people on the other side of the rope who look tired or are ready for a team change, a little non-personal heckling even. You're basically setting yourself up for success when it comes time for that tugging match. At some point, time has to be taken to reorganize ourselves, with an eye on the actual goal to get the job done. It won't ever come following the same strategy in the face of defeat. We'll get deeper into tactics in the next couple of episodes, though. It'll be a multi-part thing focused on pairing tactics to strategies and goals, so stay tuned. I'm super excited for that conversation, and please write in and share your opinions. That's what this whole thing is about. knucklesondoors@gmail.com, or go over to the forum and post up in there. You can find it at knucklesondoors.com. This is where the art of organizing comes into play. You have all these colors out there to paint with, but that doesn't mean painting just anything will be successful. Thoughtful strategy of what colors win and what combination and where. Why are you painting this and how will you produce it? When art and science collide, something special results. You can't have one without the other. That's why when thinking about getting ducks in a row, it's important to make sure you're using a combination of both art and science. A great way to get your feet underneath you when you're planning out the basics is using a SWOT analysis. Not SWAT, like swat at a fly or your kid's hand from dessert or the specialized police force. SWOT. SWOT. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. I put a template up under the resources section at knucklesondoors.com for you to use. You can also list them out on a piece of paper or just pull up a new Word doc or something. Strengths refers to what you have going for you internally. Access to cash and data, known public figures willing to help you out, a strong team of experienced activists, perhaps graphic design or communication specialists want to help. Your brother just happens to be friends with one of the primary targets. Whatever traits and stuff you and your team possess that will help advance your cause, list them. Weaknesses are obviously the opposite of strengths. What are those internal issues that will slow you down from doing good work? Maybe you don't have any cash to start things off, and you're not really connected to much. Maybe you're running for office, but you just moved to town a year or two back. Or maybe you've been in town for too long, and your skeletons are maybe a little too well known. Maybe you need to build a mobile application, and you don't know how. What traits do you possess that will make it more difficult to achieve success? Whatever they are, put those down, and be brutally honest. Opportunities are external. What's out there to help with your cultivation? Public opinion may be in favor. Perhaps there's a desire to vote the current person out of office. Maybe there was a new federal or state law recently passed requiring rules be updated, if it's some sort of a local ordinance change or something. Low voter turnout can be an opportunity if it's experienced by both you and the opposition, since it means the hill you have to climb is smaller. Perhaps there are a lot of public events for you to use to build some name recognition. Maybe the board you have to convince has been thinking about change as it is. Perhaps a big well of support in the state legislature. Think critically about it, do some research, and list your opportunities. And finally, threats. Threats are external, and what the opposition has, or is environmental, that will actively work against you. Perhaps there's an outside group spending cash already, if it's some sort of local thing. The district you're running in is loaded with voters who typically go for another party, if you're running for office. The opposition has some local celebrity supporting them. Do thorough research on your threats. Not being able to run fast enough from the bear is a weakness. The hungry bear itself is a threat, if that makes sense. Now, having your SWOT analysis on paper and organized helps you start to gain a greater understanding of where your assets and deficits lie, and can simplify the process of figuring out where your short-term and long-term goals and targets are. Oftentimes, when you have the full picture, the answer to your issues are self-evident. But without this step of intentionally sitting down and thinking it all through, you can get lost in the fight, heading in the totally wrong direction from where you need to be going. Organizing is measure twice, cut once. You can only get one chance at first introductions, so make it worth it. Now, the specific makeup of your organization should fit the specific goals and strengths you possess. It will most likely shift over time, but there are certain key areas of focus any organization will need to have to be successful. In larger groups, these areas are perfect hubs for committees to form around, and in smaller ones or campaigns, they can define the leadership roles. Generally, these include communications, finance, organizing, recruitment, and an executive team of some sort. Now, obviously, on a small campaign for soil and water, city council, or even state legislature, you'll typically only have 1 to 5 people in those leadership positions, either as paid staff and often as volunteers. Oftentimes, with people taking on multiple roles, campaign managers for small campaigns can sometimes even fill all of the roles outside of being a candidate. And in a big effort of some sort, you'll definitely want committees, with those committees being broken down even further maybe to give more people more leadership opportunities. But the standing areas of focus shouldn't change. You'll always need someone thinking about what the message should be, someone always thinking about how to get the resources you need, someone thinking about carrying out the physical part of the strategy, someone thinking about how to build pipelines for new supporters, and of course, a project manager keeping the wheels moving in the same direction. Another major consideration prior to launch is just how big of a group you'll need for optimal results. If it's an electoral campaign, obviously the answer will be 50% plus one of the vote. Otherwise, what the heck is the point? Even in a multi-person race, your win number may be 40% or something, but you should always aim for 50% plus 1 as the baseline. Hell, you should probably aim for somewhere around 57%, actually. In an advocacy effort, however, your numbers need will depend on your strategy. Clearly, you want as many people in favor of your effort as possible. The question is, who are the targets, the necessary supporters, and how do you get them on your side? Maybe it's through the use of larger groups of people. Maybe it's by working those targets' own personal networks. Maybe it's some good old-fashioned citizen lobbying. A good strategy is one that fits the goals in question. Full court press all the time wears you out, and definitely not in a good way. Sometimes that's what's necessary, especially if it's a waiting game. But issues of public opinion or personal empathy, typically the focus should be on how to get through that individual or those individuals' own psychology. How do you get to them where they care the most? Remember that while politics may be presented in a dry, disconnected way, at the end of the day, it's just a bunch of people with opinions, some using science, some using emotion, some using simple reason, some using empathy, and whether they know it or not, they're trying to find the equilibrium. Part of why our politics is so polarized right now is partially because low voter turnout in primaries allows for the most distilled rhetoric to win, which then goes up against the other distilled rhetoric head-to-head with very little mediating force. No one ever really there to say what most people are thinking, that the answer is in the gray area somewhere. When building up that initial super basic strategic plan, it's important to think about what the goals are in mind, specifically, both short and long term. As we talked about last episode, it's important to involve as many people in the decision-making process as possible, but people do better when they have a baseline to work with. That's why it's typically a good idea to show up to your first real meeting with some basic placeholder goals to dive deeper into. When developing goals, it's always best to be smart about it, both literally and figuratively. SMART goals are specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. That means you don't set goals like, we are going to win, but rather those that follow the following phrasing. I, or we, or whatever the group name is, will take a particular action to complete a specific goal by a specific time and for the purpose of a measurable result. If your goal is to win an election, for example, your long-term goal would be, I will get 50% plus 1 of the vote on election day in order to win. Now that's clearly super big and not achievable just by itself without direction. That's where your short-term goals fit in. Things like, my team will knock on at least 25% of voting households' doors by 2 weeks before election day to secure votes. We will work to increase voter turnout among 18 to 35-year-olds during early voting by 15% to decrease generational margins. I will raise $150,000 within the first 4 months to pay for a full-time campaign manager and materials to support the work. For a long-term goal, like we will get a rule put on the books regulating heavy metals to make drinking water more safe, you'd have short-term goals like we will collect 100 stories of affected people by December 15th, 2017 to share with decision makers and increase empathy. I will speak with 4 board members this next week to prepare for the upcoming meeting. Or we will have a scientific study done by March 9th to use as evidence in building our case, and so on. Your SWOT analysis is a good place to look to create sparks on what your short and long-term goals will be. As I mentioned previously, oftentimes just putting it all down on paper to look over can be enough to get you thinking about what the actual targets are and start to put it all together in your head at least. I put a template up under resources for this as well to get you identifying your long and short-term goals. The idea is to get some general ones down in preparation for your upcoming launch, so when you hold that first meeting and talk to other people and establish committees, you have an idea of the direction you're headed and what has to happen in what order. Remember, as an organizer, your job is to be the hub in the wheel. Your job isn't to do the stuff yourself, but to make sure your team is accomplishing the goals you and they have for themselves and the team at large. If you find yourself doing all the work yourself, you're simply not organizing, plain and simple. If you're working on something that will require other people in order to be successful, and no one else is working on it with you, you're simply setting yourself up for failure. Any good leader knows they do not know everything, and additional informed opinions in participants makes the end product better. Also, just on a practical level, some things just cannot be done alone. If you're running for office in a district with more than, say, 50,000 voters, it's nearly impossible to convert 50% plus 1 in a consolidated amount of time if you need to meet tens of thousands of voters. Or if you are able to, there simply aren't enough minutes in the day to keep in contact with all of them and make sure they're actually getting out to vote by yourself. At the end of the day, as Selena Myers said again, politics is about people, and people are needed to be successful in politics. There's really no way around that. Alright, so that's where I'm going to leave it for this time. We talked about being mindful of tactics and the importance to understand the variables you'll be facing in your effort. We covered SWOT analyses and how to use them to get a grasp on the fight you're walking into. Also SMART goals and the importance of setting initial goals, both short and long term. Oftentimes, your goals will make themselves evident as you do your SWOT analysis, as it'll become clear where the easy and hard routes are and when you have to take them. Next time, and I totally know I said basically the same thing at the end of last episode, we will cover meetings, promise. How to write agendas, and how to make sure you're being productive both during and after the meeting. We're building a good listenership if the stats I'm looking at are in any way valid, but please share with folks who would be interested in this content and like, follow, and rate it. Links to everything is at knucklesondoors.com. Also send in your questions, suggestions, and ideas. Want to chew me out on something I said? Also send it along. I'm no snowflake, winky face. Anyways, thanks for joining me. We'll talk icebreakers and management next time on Knuckles on Doors. Music is The Hustle by the Polyrhythmics.